A black and white scene. Snow falls endlessly over a battlefield swallowed by smoke. The world is silent, except for the low growl of tanks crawling across the frozen earth. Somewhere in the haze, a small shape moves, not a soldier, but a dog, its thin body shaking under the weight of a wooden box strapped to its back. His name was Diak, a young shepherd mix barely 2 years old. He knew nothing of politics or glory. He knew only the smell of his handler's hands, the sound of a voice that once said his name softly, a voice now lost beneath the thunder of war. The year was 1942. The Soviet Union was bleeding. German panzers were tearing through the steppes, unstoppable, mechanical beasts devouring everything in their path. The Red Army was desperate. Rifles were few. Ammunition was scarce. So they turned to something else, loyalty itself. They trained dogs to do what men could not, to run under tanks, to carry explosives, to sacrifice. Diak had been one of them, part of a secret program hidden in the forests east of Moscow. For months, handlers taught the animals to seek out the smell of diesel, the sound of clattering tracks, the vibration of steel. When the moment came, they would crawl beneath the tank and never return. Ivan Orlov, Diak's handler, had joined the program after losing his brother near Smolensk. He believed the dogs would turn the tide of the war. He believed every life, no matter how small, could serve the motherland. But belief fades fast when you have to look into the eyes of a creature that trusts you completely and send it to die. In the snow, Ivan knelt beside Diak, his hands trembling as he fastened the final buckle. The dog licked his fingers. Ivan whispered something too soft to hear. Then he let go of the leash. Diak ran. His paws kicked up the snow, his tail cutting through the wind. The tank loomed ahead, black smoke pouring from its engine. The ground shook beneath him. He didn't stop. He never looked back. There was a flash, a burst of light brighter than the winter sun. Then, silence. When the smoke lifted, the tank was gone, reduced to twisted metal. Soldiers stared in awe. The battlefield held its breath. In the crater's center, the snow was burning, and beside it lay a torn collar, embroidered with a single number. They called it a success. They called it heroism. But for Ivan, it was something else entirely. He walked across the field, his boots crunching over the frozen mud. The others cheered, shouted, raised their rifles to the sky. He said nothing. He just stood there, looking at the blackened patch of earth where Diak had vanished. In that silence, victory felt colder than death. Later that night, Ivan wrote a report by candlelight. The ink froze before he finished the last line. Mission complete. He wrote, the tank destroyed, the handler unfit for further service. He folded the paper, and his hand trembled. Outside, the wind howled across the Russian steppe, carrying with it the faint echoes of barking hundreds of them, fading into the distance. They would call these dogs heroes of the motherland. They would print their stories in newspapers, hang their pictures in barracks. But behind every medal, there was a story that no one wanted to tell, a story of trust turned into a weapon, of love consumed by war. Somewhere in the darkness, a soldier's voice whispered to no one, "Good boy." The snow kept falling, covering the scars of the battlefield, as if the earth itself wanted to forget. But history never truly forgets. This was not just the tale of brave animals or clever tactics. It was a tragedy born from desperation, a war where even loyalty became expendable. In the next moments, you'll discover how a nation, pushed to its breaking point, turned man's best friend into a weapon, and the haunting truth that followed. A black and white memory fades in the ruins of Stalingrad. Winter of 1942. Snow falls gently over the bones of a broken city. The echoes of tank engines have faded, replaced by the whimper of strayed dogs searching for food among the rubble. It was here, in the heart of suffering, that the truth of the Soviet war dogs began to take shape. At first, the idea seemed noble, even heroic. The Soviet Union needed every advantage to survive. Factories had been bombed, armies shattered, and villages burned to dust. The panzers, those massive German tanks, were symbols of unstoppable power, their iron tracks grinding over entire divisions. How could flesh and blood stand against steel? The answer, they thought, lay in something simple, loyal, and unquestioning. If a human soldier could not reach a tank, perhaps a dog could. So began one of the most tragic chapters of military experimentation in history. In secret training camps scattered from Moscow to the Urals, hundreds of dogs were gathered, shepherds, mongrels, strays pulled from the streets. They were trained not as companions, but as weapons. The program's goal was terrifyingly precise. Teach them to crawl under the belly of enemy tanks carrying timed explosives. The official reports called them anti-tank units of animal origin, but to the soldiers who lived beside them, they were still dogs, living creatures with names, personalities, fears, each one paired with a handler who would train them, feed them, and in the end, send them to die. Ivan Orlov's Diak was only one among hundreds. Others had names like Rena, Lada, Boris. In letters sent from the front, handlers described them like family members. She sleeps near my rifle. One wrote, when the shells fall, she doesn't run. She looks at me waiting for my command. But behind those tender words was a horror few could speak of. Many soldiers knew that the training was flawed from the start. The dogs were trained to recognize Soviet diesel engines, not German ones. On the battlefield, when chaos erupted, they often ran toward the wrong tanks. Toward their own, reports were censored, losses hidden. Commanders praised successes while quietly counting how many men and dogs had died together. It wasn't heroism, it was tragedy repeated in silence. Still, the propaganda machine turned these stories into symbols. Posters showed heroic dogs running under tanks, explosions painted like halos of light. Weapons of the people's faith, the headline said. The truth was never mentioned. What makes this story matter isn't the tactics, nor the statistics. It's what it says about humanity, about what desperation can do to love, to trust, to loyalty itself, in a world where machines ruled the battlefield. The Soviets tried to fight with the purest thing left, devotion. But devotion cannot be controlled. It cannot be programmed. It can only be betrayed. When Ivan Orlov returned from Stalingrad, his comrades called him a survivor. He didn't feel like one. He had destroyed enemy tanks, yes, but he had also destroyed something inside himself. The memory of Diak haunted him, not as a victory, but as a wound that would never heal. In later years, when reporters asked veterans about the war dogs, most went silent. Some smiled faintly and said they were brave. Others simply turned away. A few cried, because they remembered not just the explosions, but the eyes that looked back at them before the command was given. And that is why this story matters. It's not about strategy or innovation. It's about the human cost of desperation, about the thin line between courage and cruelty, about how, in war, even the most innocent hearts can be weaponized. The story of the Soviet war dogs is not just history, it's a mirror. It forces us to look at what we become when survival replaces compassion. When love is rewritten as duty. In the next part, you'll step into that hidden world, the training camps deep in the Russian forests. You'll see how these dogs were chosen, conditioned, and deployed. And you'll learn how the truth behind their missions was covered, rewritten, and finally forgotten by history itself. Because this was never just a military experiment. It was a lesson written in fur, blood, and silence, one that still asks us today, how far will humanity go when the line between survival and morality disappears? The world is frozen in gray. It is early 1942, and the Soviet Union stands on the edge of collapse. German divisions are advancing like an iron tide, swift, relentless, merciless. In the east, villages are burning. In the west, Moscow trembles beneath the sound of artillery. The snow has turned black from smoke. Factories once alive with workers are now silent skeletons. Men are gone to the front. Women and children dig trenches by hand. Hunger grips the cities. Hope is rationed like bread. Every day, new orders arrive from the Kremlin. Hold the line. No retreat. It was in this desperate silence that strange ideas began to emerge. Ideas born not from strength, but from the refusal to die. Somewhere in a small office near the Ministry of Defense, a report landed on a desk. Use of dogs as anti-tank weapons feasible. The idea wasn't entirely new. During the earlier wars, animals had carried messages, pulled sleds, rescued the wounded. But now, in this war of machines, they would be turned into something else entirely. Not messengers, not helpers, weapons. Across the forests of the Moscow Oblast, training camps began to appear secret, isolated, surrounded by barbed wire. Soldiers called them the kennels of the motherland. Here, under the supervision of military engineers and animal trainers, the first generation of anti-tank dogs was born. At the Pavlovsky Training Center, the air reeked of diesel and frozen meat. In rows of wooden cages, hundreds of dogs waited German shepherds, Alsatians, even street strays caught from Moscow alleys. They were hungry, restless, confused, but to their handlers, they were no longer pets. They were soldiers. Ivan Orlov arrived at Pavlovsky in March 1942. He was 23, thin from the front lines, his uniform torn and eyes hollow. Like many soldiers, he had lost everything: family, friends, and a sense of normal life. When the instructor handed him a leash and said, "Train this one," he took it without question. The dog's name was Diak. Training began at dawn each day. The soldiers taught their dogs to run toward tanks using food rewards. They starved them for hours, then placed meat beneath the hulls of old Soviet vehicles. The dogs learned to crawl low, to ignore the noise, to find the smell of diesel. Weeks later, explosives were added: wooden packs filled with TNT, designed to detonate when pressed against the belly of a tank. The theory was simple. The dog would run under the enemy tank. The lever would trigger the bomb, and both would vanish. But in practice, nothing was simple. The dogs were terrified of the engine noise. Some froze. Others fled. Instructors yelled. Soldiers wept, and the snow turned red from accidents. Yet the order remained the same. Continue training. We have no time. As summer came, the first units were sent to the front. Officially, they were called the anti-tank dog squads of the Red Army. Unofficially, soldiers whispered another name: the Silent Battalion. They traveled by train, packed in wooden crates alongside ammunition. In letters home, handlers wrote about their animals like comrades. "Rena eats from my hand. She knows the sound of my boots." Another wrote, "They say dogs don't understand fear. They are wrong." Meanwhile, propaganda spread across the nation. Newspapers printed heroic stories of dogs destroying German tanks. Children in schools were told to love and honor them. Posters showed smiling soldiers beside brave animals, both serving the motherland. But the truth was hidden behind those smiles. At the front, confusion reigned. The dogs, trained on Soviet diesel engines, could not tell the difference between friend and foe. When battle began and chaos erupted, many turned back toward familiar scents, the Soviet tanks they had trained under. Explosions tore through friendly lines. Panic spread. Commanders blamed handlers. Handlers blamed training. But deep down, everyone knew it wasn't the dog's fault. It was the war's. Still, Moscow refused to abandon the program. They improved the design, added better explosives, shortened fuses, changed tactics. Each improvement demanded more lives. The Red Army was losing thousands of men each week. If even a single tank could be stopped, it was worth it. That was the logic of desperation. And through it all, soldiers like Ivan Orlov carried on. He slept beside Diak in the barracks, shared his ration bread, whispered to him during air raids. When he looked into the dog's eyes, he saw something pure, untouched by ideology, and that purity made the coming orders unbearable. In the autumn of 1942, Diak and Ivan were assigned to the 27th Guards Rifle Division, stationed near Stalingrad. The battle there was unlike anything the world had ever seen, a city reduced to rubble, where men fought for every room, every staircase, every breath. Tanks rolled through streets filled with corpses and ash. That was where the dogs were unleashed for the first time en masse. That was where loyalty met fire. Each handler knew what it meant. When they released the leash, they were sending away a part of themselves. Many couldn't bear to watch. Some turned away. Some prayed. And when the explosions came, when the tanks stopped and smoke rose into the gray sky, they didn't cheer. They just stood in silence. Back in Moscow, officials wrote reports of great success. Medals were prepared. The truth that hundreds of dogs died confused, frightened, misunderstood was buried in archives for decades. Yet, even amid the horror, there were moments of quiet grace. A few dogs returned from the field, wounded but alive. Soldiers fed them from their own bowls, calling them comrade. One veteran later wrote, "They saved us, not with cunning or weapons, but with their hearts." The camera of memory lingers on those words, black ink on yellowed paper, written by hands that once trembled in the cold. This was the world from which the story of Diak was born. A world where hope had teeth, where loyalty wore a collar, and where the line between hero and victim disappeared in the snow. In the next part, you'll see the mission unfold the day when Diak, the nameless soldier's dog, ran into history and into tragedy. A black and white morning. The ruins of Stalingrad stretch endlessly, a graveyard of steel and snow. The air smells of smoke and iron. Buildings have no walls, only jagged shadows against the winter light. Somewhere deep inside this frozen maze, a group of Soviet soldiers crouch in silence among them. Ivan Orlov and his dog, Diak. The orders were simple, but the cost was not. German tanks had broken through the defensive line. They were pushing toward the river. The Red Army's anti-tank guns were destroyed. Radio lines were dead. If those panzers reached the supply depots, the entire regiment would be lost. Ivan was chosen because Diak never hesitated in training. The instructors said he was reliable, fast, obedient. They didn't know what that really meant, that Diak's obedience came not from fear, but from trust, a trust that Ivan now had to betray. Snow whipped through the cracks of the ruined house where they waited. The men checked their weapons, their hands shaking not from the cold, but from what they knew was coming. Outside, the rumble of engines grew louder, steady, mechanical, inhuman. Ivan knelt beside Diak. The dog's breath came out in white clouds. He looked up, waiting for a command. Ivan's hand trembled as he adjusted the wooden pack strapped to Diak's back. The metal fuse clicked, faintly armed. For a moment, Ivan closed his eyes. He could still remember the day he found Diak, a starving stray near the camp's gate. He had given him his last piece of bread. The dog had followed him ever since. Now, that same dog was his weapon. The ground shook. The first panzer appeared, a massive beast painted gray, its turret turning slowly. The sound was deafening. Soviet soldiers pressed themselves against the rubble, whispering prayers. The tank's gun fired once. A nearby building exploded into dust. Ivan whispered, "Go." Diak darted forward. Snow burst beneath his paws. He weaved through debris, the pack of explosives bouncing with each step. The German gunners didn't notice him, not yet. To them, he was just a blur in the smoke. A shell screamed overhead. The blast threw Ivan to the ground. He looked up just in time to see Diak disappearing into the gray mist. His heart stopped. For a moment, everything slowed, the snow falling soundlessly, the smoke curling in the wind, the world holding its breath. Then, the flash, a sound like thunder split the air. The tank lifted from the ground, torn apart from beneath. Fire roared through its belly, black smoke billowing into the sky. Men shouted, some cheering, some crying. The mission had succeeded. But Diak never came back. Ivan stumbled toward the crater. His vision blurred. The heat scorched his face. In the center of the blast, nothing remained but twisted metal, burning oil, and a small, charred collar half buried in the snow. His hands trembled as he picked it up. The name tag was gone. Only a number remained. He fell to his knees. Around him, soldiers shouted orders, reloaded rifles, prepared for the next wave. No one looked at him. To them, it was just another day in Stalingrad. But for Ivan, the world had stopped moving. That night, the unit held the line. German reinforcements pulled back, leaving their burning tanks behind. The Red Army's counterattack began at dawn. In the reports, it was written as an act of heroism by canine units. The newspapers would later call it the triumph of Soviet ingenuity. But Ivan couldn't read those words. He sat by a dying fire, holding the metal tag in his fist. His comrades tried to comfort him, but there were no words left. One soldier whispered, "He did his duty." "Comrade!" Ivan didn't answer. He just stared at the snow, still falling, covering the remains of what had once been his only friend. Days later, Ivan was ordered to train new recruits in handling war dogs. He refused. "I can't," he said quietly. The officer looked at him, confused. "You were successful. Orlov, the motherland needs men like you." Ivan shook his head. "No, sir, it wasn't me. It was him." The officer sighed and walked away. Ivan was reassigned to logistics. He never handled another dog again. But others continued the work. The program expanded, spreading to other fronts. Reports came in of success and failure, of bravery and chaos. Thousands of dogs were deployed, some under tanks, some carrying grenades, others scouting minefields. Most never returned. Each explosion marked a victory on paper, but a loss in the heart. And for every destroyed Panzer, a handler somewhere in the snow whispered a name that history would never remember. Months passed. Stalingrad was finally won, at a cost so high that even victory felt like mourning. When Ivan left the city, he carried with him only one thing, the collar. He kept it hidden in his coat, close to his chest, as if the warmth of his body could somehow keep the memory alive. He would survive the war. He would return home. But the sound of that explosion and the last look in Diak's eyes would follow him for the rest of his life. Years later, when people asked him what courage meant, he never spoke of battles or medals. He simply said, "It's when you go where your heart tells you, even if it breaks you." The snow continued to fall over the fields where so many lives had ended, men and dogs alike. In those black and white memories, time stood still. The tanks were gone. The guns were silent. But if you listened closely, you could almost hear the faint echo of footsteps, the bark of a dog running toward destiny. And in that moment, you realize this was never a story of victory. It was a story of love, obedience, and loss written in snow, sealed by fire. A black and white dawn rises over a city of ghosts. Stalingrad is silent now. The tanks are husks. The snow has buried the trenches, and the river carries only ashes downstream. The war has moved west. But here, among the frozen ruins, memories remain like footsteps that never melt. Ivan Orlov walks through what was once a battlefield. Every sound feels louder in the emptiness. The creak of his boots, the whisper of wind through broken windows. He stops where the crater still scars the ground. The soil is darker here, mixed with oil and smoke. He kneels and places a small piece of metal Diak's collar tag into the earth. "You did it, boy," he murmurs. His breath fades in the cold air. The official reports say the mission succeeded. German armor destroyed. Front line stabilized. They even mention a medal for valor in service of the motherland. But Ivan never accepted it. "How do you give a medal," he once said, "to someone who didn't know he was a soldier?" The truth of the war dog program remained hidden for decades. The archives described efficiency, not sorrow. Statistics, not faces. More than 10,000 dogs were trained. Only a handful survived. Some handlers went missing in action. Others, like Ivan, returned home and never spoke of it again. In 1950, a military journal quietly declassified part of the project. It called the program an experimental success with tactical limitations. But between the lines, veterans read something else, an unspoken apology. Letters found years later told another story. One from a handler named Mikhail read, "They told us we were saving the motherland, but I think the dog saved us. They reminded us what loyalty meant, even when the world had forgotten." Another wrote, "When the tanks stopped coming, we still heard them barking in our dreams. Time softened the language, but not the pain." In museums, photographs of these dogs were hung beside maps and rifles. Children stared at the black and white faces behind the glass. They saw bravery. The veterans who stood behind them saw loss. Ivan lived to see peace. He worked quietly as a factory clerk, his war stories locked away like old documents. Neighbors said he fed every stray that wandered near his door. He never owned another dog. But the sound of paws on pavement always made him look up. In 1965, when the government built a memorial for animals of war, Ivan attended the ceremony. He stood apart from the crowd, a gray coat blending into the mist. As the wreath was laid, he whispered again the same two words he had spoken in the snow, "Good boy." Then he turned and walked away. Decades passed. The world changed. The war faded into textbooks. But the story of the Soviet war dogs resurfaced not as propaganda, but as a lesson. Historians uncovered the documents, the training manuals, the censored reports. They read about Pavlovsky Camp, about Diak and Rena, and hundreds of others whose names never appeared in print. For the first time, the world saw the truth, that these animals were not heroes in the way medals define heroism. They were victims of human desperation, caught in a struggle they never chose, yet still giving everything they had. In one museum in Volgograd, a single display case holds a rusted collar, its tag half burned. The plaque beneath it reads, "Unknown War Dog, 1942, faithful until the end." Visitors often stand in silence before it. Some smile softly, some wipe their eyes. Because even in that small piece of metal, there is something eternal, a reminder that courage does not always roar. Sometimes it walks on four legs and disappears into smoke. And so the story closes where it began. A snowy field, a loyal heart, and a choice no one should ever have to make. The tanks are gone. The soldiers are gone. But somewhere in the vast memory of the world, a young dog still runs through the snow toward the sound of engines, not for war, not for glory, but for the only thing he ever understood, loyalty. A black and white dusk settles over the ruins of memory. The wind moves gently through the empty fields outside Stalingrad, bending the grass that now grows where men once fell. The guns are silent, but echoes still live beneath the soil, in the rust of bullets, in the quiet of forgotten names. When people speak of war, they often speak of heroes, of generals, of battles, of victory. Rarely do they speak of the silent ones, those who carried no weapons, who asked no questions, who simply followed the only thing they ever trusted, a voice, a scent, a heartbeat. The story of the Soviet war dogs is not only about history, it is about the fragile thread that ties loyalty to suffering, about how love, once placed in human hands, can be both protected and destroyed. After the war, scientists studied the effectiveness of the dog mine units. They debated tactics, design, and results. But no statistic could capture what really happened on those snowy fields the moment a pair of eyes met another, and trust became tragedy. In a world consumed by survival, compassion became a luxury. The Soviet handlers were not monsters. They were men broken by hunger and fear, ordered to turn loyalty into a weapon because there was nothing else left to fight with. Each time they fastened a harness, they made a choice that killed a piece of themselves. And yet, amid all the cruelty, something beautiful survived. The dogs ran not because of ideology, but because of devotion. They didn't understand war. They understood love, and they followed it, even into fire. That is the haunting truth. Loyalty is the purest thing a living being can give, and in war, it is also the first thing betrayed. Decades later, the veterans who once trained those animals could still recall their faces. One man said, "We taught them to destroy tanks, but they taught us what it means to be human." Another wrote, "They never abandoned us. Even when we abandoned them, the black and white photographs remain grainy, quiet, eternal." In them, a man kneels beside a dog, snow on his cap, sorrow in his smile. To the historian, it is an image of training. To the soldier, it is a confession. And to us, it is a mirror. We live in an age of noise and machines once again faster, colder, more efficient. But the questions remain the same. What do we sacrifice in the name of progress? What do we call victory when compassion is left behind? Perhaps that is why these old stories still matter. Because they remind us that strength without empathy is just another form of emptiness. That even in the darkest moments, The measure of our humanity is found not in our power, but in how we treat those who cannot understand our wars. Somewhere, in that endless expanse of Russian snow, Diak's footprints are long erased, but the idea he carried that trust can exist even in a world without mercy remains. In the quiet of reflection, you realize this was never a story about animals. It was about us, about the strange, painful beauty of loyalty, and the unbearable cost of using it for destruction. In a world of noise, the truest messages are still carried in silence. Sometimes, on four paws, a black and white still fades in. The snow has stopped. The battlefield is quiet now, a vast white plain under a pale morning sun. No tanks, no soldiers, only the whisper of wind moving over the frozen earth. This is where the story ends. And yet, somehow, it doesn't, because stories like this, small, forgotten, uncomfortable, are what make history human again. They remind us that courage has many faces, and not all of them wear uniforms. Sometimes courage crawls on four legs through the smoke, driven not by orders, but by love. These are the stories time almost forgot, the ones hidden beneath victory parades and medals, the ones too painful to celebrate, too pure to erase. And if we stop telling them, they disappear just like the paw prints that once marked the snow outside Stalingrad. That's why remembering matters. Every photograph, every letter, every name carved into the cold archives of history, they're not just relics, they're reminders. They ask us to look closer, to feel, to question, to remember that behind every weapon was a human hand, trembling with doubt. Behind every command, a heart breaking in silence. If this story moved you, don't let it fade. Keep it alive. Share it. Speak of it. Because history isn't written only by men with guns and medals. Sometimes it's carried by the soft tread of paws, by a loyal heart that never understood the word enemy. We live in a world that often forgets the quiet ones, those who serve without asking for glory. But it is in their silence that we find truth. The dogs of war did not choose their fate. Yet, through them, we see the cost of ours. So when you think of courage, remember Diak, not as a weapon, not as a tool, but as a symbol of what loyalty means when everything else is gone. Subscribe, if you wish, not for numbers or algorithms, but to keep these voices alive, to honor the forgotten, to give their stories a place to rest. Because history doesn't belong to those who win. It belongs to those who remember. And sometimes, the greatest stories of war aren't about men or machines at all. They're about a single heartbeat in the snow, running toward fire, for nothing but love. Sometimes, it's carried by four paws,